Can everybody please take your seats so we can get started? And as you're taking your seats, please turn off your phones. Oh, it's 1:30 already. Okay. For those who are just joining us, welcome to the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival of 2025. Thank you for coming and supporting these authors and for your appreciation of great writing. We're happy you're here. The way to support this festival and the authors that participate in it is to buy their books from Bunch of Grapes bookstore located here at the festival. The book sales tent is where I'm pointing. And then book signings follow every session. Today's panelists will be signing their books in the book signing tent over there. Don't go hungry. We have food. Please buy it and support 3 island vendors, and water is available throughout the festival site thanks to Island Source. If you need anything, see one of the ushers, volunteers, or go into the info tent. I have a note here that a limited number of tote bags is still available, but the last I looked, there were like 3. So if you want one, get one. The panelists will take questions from the audience at the end of the discussion, and when asking a question, please line up at the microphone, one of the 2 microphones in the aisles. And do not make long statements. Let the others have a chance to speak, and let the author speak. So I'd like to introduce to you our next panel, the Complicated Family Unit. It's with Susan Dominus, Elinor Lipman, and Sophia Sinclair, and moderated by Ron Charles. The ever-changing and always formative family unit is a staple of memoirs, fiction, and journalistic investigation. Writers working across the genres will share insight and invite discussion on the complex nature of family life and relations in contemporary society. Susan Dominus is a New York Times journalist and author of The Family Dynamic, A Journey into the Mystery of Sibling Success, a deep exploration of 6 families that boast multiple children who achieve extraordinary success and what factors lead to that success. At the New York Times, Dominus won a 2018 Pulitzer Prize for her team's reporting on workplace sexual harassment. She teaches journalism at Yale University. Elinor Lipman is an award-winning author of 16 books, including The Inn at Lake Devine, Ms. Demeanor, and I Can't Complain, all 2 personal essays. Her latest work, Every Tom, Dick, and Harry, continues her tradition of charm, humor, and social satire, featuring a quirky cast of characters and a delightful romantic hero. Sophia Sinclair, a Jamaican poet and memoirist, is the National Book Critics Circle Award for How to Say Babylon. This memoir about breaking free from a strict religious upbringing to find her own voice was a New York Times notable book, a Time Top 10 nonfiction selection, and featured on Barack Obama's reading list. Sinclair is the author of the award-winning poetry collection, Cannibal. She's an associate professor of creative writing at Arizona State University. And finally, our moderator, Ron Charles, is the longtime book critic and deputy editor of Book World at the Washington Post, where he reviews fiction and writes a weekly newsletter, The Book Club. Before joining the Post in 2005, he taught English and edited the book section of the Christian Science Monitor. Charles and his wife Dawn create the Totally Hip video book review, a satirical but thoughtful commentary on book review culture and publishing hype. Ron.
Thank you. Thank you much. It's such a pleasure to be here with these three extraordinary writers. Ironically, over the past few weeks, our little group has already suffered some of the trials of complicated family units. We lost two members, pulled away by other relatives and romantic entanglements, and gained through adoption a new member. Thank you for that. This is the first panel I've moderated in a while. Many years ago, I was asked to moderate a discussion between a geneticist and a rabbi. This is not a joke, I promise. It was an assignment for which I had no qualifications, and soon after it began, I lost all control of the discussion. We got so bad after a while that the rabbi and the geneticist are arguing, and I was just kind of sitting there, and a woman stood up in the back and walked down the center aisle to the lip of the stage and hissed up at me, "You've got to get this thing under control!" So we got to do better than that. Tolstoy said all happy families are alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And the poet Philip Larkin put it more succinctly, I'm paraphrasing here. They mess you up, your mom and dad. My wife edited that quote. What I love about this fascinating trio of writers is that they approach the family in such distinct ways. One investigated a group of families, one told about her own family, and one invented a family. In all their works, we find the family as a source of inspiration and conflict and comedy and sometimes liberation. Before we begin, could I ask each of you to describe your book briefly so that as we talk, people have them in mind as we run through the discussion? Susan.
That's a great idea. Thank you so much for moderating, Ron, at the last minute, and thank you all for being here. Thank you to the Vineyard Festival. My book is called The Family Dynamic, and it's about, it takes a very close narrative look at 6 complicated but very unusually high-achieving families, and the chapters about the families alternate with chapters about social science and reflections on the limits of social science about parenting.
My new book, Every Tom, Dick, and Harry. It's the narrator is 32-year-old Emma. She's just been handed the reins of her parents' estate sale business, and they do it out of concern and pity because she doesn't have much of a career or even a place to live. So she gets the house and the business, and it generally the big get for her business is a house on the most beautiful street in the fictional Harrow, Massachusetts, that turns out to have, in its past, it was a brothel. So,
my book is a memoir about growing up in Jamaica under a strict Rastafari family, and how, the repressive rules that my father placed for me, how I began to rebel against that through my discovery of poetry, which led me to finding my own voice and defining womanhood on my own terms.
Thank you. Susan, in The Family Dynamic, you explore the psychological impact of sibling rivalry and sibling support and parental expectations. I suspect you went into that with some kind of thesis or hypothesis. Can you tell us about a moment when all those expectations and your original hypothesis were sort of upended?
That is true. I think I went into this book thinking it was going to be a pretty straightforward investigation about some common threads among parents who were very good at motivating their children and inspiring them. And 2 things happened along the way as I was reporting. One of them was that you get pretty quickly to very good social science and behavioral genetic science that suggests that parenting impacts are much, much smaller than we think they are, which is great news or terrible news depending on how you feel about it, but I choose to see it as very liberating. And then in the narratives of the stories, so many of the people I was interviewing who had these incredible siblings said, it actually wasn't about my parents. I mean, they were there in the background and we knew they had expectations, but my brother, or my sister. And it really turned on its head so much about what we think about what influences us and what creates motivation. I think about the siblings of the Chen family who were children of immigrants, and the young people in that family telling me that each of them wanted the younger sibling to be better than they themselves had been. And they really helped each other in very concrete ways. And I really understood the parents were setting, this arrow of ambition in the air, but the siblings were the ones helping them land it.
Interesting. And then, Sophia, your poetry collection, Cannibal, was such a revelation to me. I read that years before the memoir. The memoir describes a very vivid scenes of childhood obedience and rebellion in Jamaica. How did the idea of writing a memoir evolve out of the poetry? Was it a shift in genre that was very natural, or did it involve some real changes for you?
I'll say it also involves like childhood excellence, as you were speaking. And now that you say that, parents have a smaller percentage to do with it, it's a true revelation. I'm going to go tell my mom. There was so much that I knew I wanted to say about growing up Rastafari in Jamaica. And a lot of it became clear to me when I came to the US to study for college, just how much was not known about Jamaica and about Rastafari. So many of the things that I got asked at college were nonsensical. I got asked things like, are you related to Bob Marley? Do you live in a hammock? And I thought, wow, these people need an education. And so, that was kind of one of the seedlings of wanting to write this story and write it in prose and write it in a way that re-narrativizes these kind of stereotypical ideas of Jamaica beyond this postcard paradise idea of Jamaica, and also to give a view of Rastafari from a woman's perspective, because I think when a lot of people think of Rastafari, they think of the men. It's a very patriarchal sort of dominated image, and probably one man in particular you think of when you think of Rastafari. So for me, it was important to give a portraiture of Jamaican womanhood and Rastafari girlhood from my perspective.
Interesting. And Elinor, your novel uses a sudden change of occupation as a catalyst to examine family tensions. Over more than a dozen novels now, what is it that draws you to comedy as a lens to look at family? And you can't just say because you're a funny person.
Mm-hmm. No, I wasn't going to say that at all, because people, I just write down what I observe or what goes through my head. I later find out that people find those observations funny. And people ask me if I laugh when I'm writing, and I say never. If I think I'm making a joke, I cut it. So it's a hard question to answer because I'm just trying to tell the story and make it interesting. And so I'm not setting out, it surprises me. And when people laugh at a line at a reading, then I'm always surprised. But then at the next place, if people don't laugh at that same line, I'm a little disappointed. Yeah.
Let's talk about secrets. Families use secrets to protect, to punish, to preserve their image of themselves. I'm curious what role secrets play in your books. Elinor, your novel contains this wonderfully absurd but believable secret. What do comedic secrets reveal or suggest about a family's need to maintain order?
Oh, that's a hard question. Let me think. Okay, to maintain order. Well, I'm opposed to too much secret keeping because when I teach, and I believe in this myself, that as John Gardner said on Becoming a Novelist, the writer always make the reader an equal partner. Yeah. So I feel that you shouldn't, if you have a secret, then, let it air it early enough, make the reader an equal partner, because I feel it's like a cheap trick.
Oh, interesting. And Sophia, in How to Say Babylon, silence is often enforced, especially around your father's authority.
Yeah.
How did that secrecy shape your adolescence, and what was it like to open up that silence. There must have been a lot of pressure not to. Did that tension between the desire to reveal and the desire to protect shape the book?
I think of it less as secrecy. I think silence is a good way to think about it. I think my father and some Rastafari brethren would define the sort of perfect daughter, or the sort of, in their idea, the perfect Rasta woman, someone who is obedient, silent, and pliant. Yeah, and so for me, from a pretty early age, I'd say about 10 or maybe younger, I began to question this idea of obedience, the way that it's wrapped up in the idea of being compliant or being silent because of my gender.
So even being a poet was something opposed by that culture.
Yes, and actually it was discovering poetry, which is something I always credit to my mom, right? So she always had me and my siblings read and recite poems. She was very interested in making sure we were anchored in the world of literature. And it was something, when I discovered poetry and I wrote my first poem, that I realized that there was a voice that I could nurture on the page and a self that I could nurture outside of my father's, outside of his glance. And I could hone this self and hone this voice, which eventually became the thing that gave me the strength to speak and eventually write this book.
Wonderful. And Susan, in your reporting, did you encounter families who, I'm sure you did, who resisted your attempts to dig deeper? And how did you navigate that ethical tension between, your journalistic inquiry and your principles as a journalist, and then the family's privacy, which I'm sure you had to respect too?
I have to say that it writing about family is like, digging into people's most tender, sensitive stories about themselves. And I think that sometimes there were things that were, so for example, one of the brothers in the family was the oldest in a large Mexican-American family of children of immigrants to go to college. And as we all know, it's very hard for first-generation, low-income, minority kids to make it in college, that if they're the first in their family. Now, because he had been at Kansas, he was able to really encourage, University of Kansas, he was able to encourage his younger siblings to go and help them through the financial aid process and tell them which professors to take. But they all noticed at a certain point that when he was supposed to have graduated, he hadn't actually graduated, and that he was still kind of hanging around and going to class and fraternity parties. And he kept saying he was applying to law school. And what was astonishing to me is they said to me, "We know that Alfred never graduated." They had never said anything to Alfred about it. They had never had that conversation. And as a reporter, sometimes you're given something like this and you don't feel like you can write a true story unless you somehow get into it. So you sound out the person whose secret has been shared. And I have to say, I think it was helpful for Alfred finally to have it be said out loud and for me to talk him through. But this is a very common phenomenon for people in your situation. So as a reporter, you often think you're airing a secret. It could be very painful, but sometimes you can't ignore it, and you can't count on this being the case, but it can be very helpful for people to finally be airing these conversations.
That changes your role from journalist to semi-family therapist.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, I think many journalists, certainly long-form journalists, say that there's an element of therapy in everything they do.
Families often assign roles to one another as protector or black sheep or overachiever or the rebel. And I wanted you to talk about, in your books, how you grapple with the tension between who we are and who our families want us to be. Back to you, Susan. The families you profile contain multiple successful children. How did those assigned roles, the elder, the fixer, the favorite, did they seem to influence the outcome, or were they able to break beyond those roles?
Let me think about that for a second. One thing we know about siblings is that they do tend to differentiate, I would say. So Sarah True, who's an Olympic triathlete and a world-class Ironman champion, who's now getting her PhD in psychology, an extraordinary human being, will tell you that she went into sports not because her parents were assigning roles, but because her two older siblings were so incredibly academic. One of her sister is the novelist Lauren Groff. I'm sure many people here know her beautiful fiction. So Sarah just felt like she couldn't compete in that arena, and so she really invested in becoming a world-class athlete. And she really thinks that was, to some degree, in opposition to her siblings, but not about her parents. It was her seeing her place in the world and how she could get there.
You're the mother of twins.
Yes.
This must tempt you to conduct experiments.
Twins are a natural experiment, and raising them is an exercise in humility.
Sophia, your father's strict expectations of you were rooted in this patriarchal religious system that you mentioned. How did you and your siblings resist those expectations along with you?
You know, it's interesting with the question before. You said, oh, in the family you have the black sheep, the rebel, the overachiever, and somehow I was all three. You know, I'm the eldest of four, and so I'm the eldest daughter, and I have two sisters. And so, you know, there was an interesting dynamic when I was growing up that my brother and I, we were closest in age, and we were very, very close. And then there came a time, I think when I was about 9 years old, where my father said, he basically said to my brother, you can't be following behind your sisters anymore. You're taking a different path. And then he said, my sisters and I, you know, we couldn't wear pants or shorts anymore. There were all these rules that came because only to me and my sisters. And I saw in that moment that things were different for me than they were for my brother. You know, we would run around the yard and we used to climb trees, and my father said, well, you're a girl, so you can't climb trees anymore. You can't ride a bicycle. You know, there were all these things, and those rules specifically, and seeing how the roads diverged between me and my brother was one of the things that led me to questioning the rules, because I was like, well, why can't I climb the tree? You know, and I'm watching him climb the mango tree with much jealousy. And then I began to think about my younger sisters, and every time the rules were implemented, I was kind of the first one to experience it, you know, because I was the eldest. And I wondered if their lives were going to go the same way as I got older. And I thought, well, I didn't want their lives to go that way. And so I rebelled, I think, even more because of that. And I thought whatever anger would come, I would take it if it meant that they would have something different.
For them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Elinor, in Tom, Dick, and Harry, your heroine ends up running the family business somewhat reluctantly.
Yes.
What did that expectation mean to you in terms of the emotional demands that parents put on their children? This is that's what Emma's going through, right? She's taken on this burden that her parents have given her, but it's not really a burden; it's kind of a blessing too.
Well, it is, but see, I like to take a character, especially a main character, my narrator, and I like to bring her along. And so I liked the fact that she had self-doubts and social doubts and professional doubts, for sure. And that I would sort of, help her along in like bring her to charm school. And so it was more, plot driven than sort of family driven. The parents are just so kind on every page, which, I worry about that a little because I was raised in an extremely functional family. So
that's such a burden for a novelist.
I know it is. Yeah.
But you have overcome it.
Even more so, a memoirist. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no memoirs. Right. So it was. Yes. Did that answer the question? Yeah.
The emotional demands that parents put on their children, even nice ones.
Oh, yes. Oh, for sure. And they claim that they're retiring. They're moving to, they're moving to the Cape. I forget where I put them, but it's sort of early Cape. And under the guise of, we need someone to take over the business. And they had called it Finders Keepers, and she wants something a little more, sort of gestalty. So she names it A State of Mind, E-State of Mind, and a few other things. So there's a lot of give and take, and a lot of mistakes, but that's good for the plot.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Some characters in your books escape damaging family patterns. Others remain entangled. What does it take, in your view, to break free or to make peace? Sophia, I'm interested. You describe poetry and education as paths out of Babylon.
Yeah.
How did tell us more about how your mother... Oh,
this.
yes.
America is Babylon.
Yeah. But you have, in a way, you have... Well, I won't put the words in your mouth, but how did your mother figure into that eventual liberation for you? Give us more about that.
Let me just say a little bit more about Babylon, right?
Yes.
So for the Rastafari, I think most people have this idea of Rastafari, but in actuality in Jamaica, the Rastafari are a persecuted minority historically. Most people might be surprised to know that the Rastas in Jamaica are 1% or less of the population, that they were, turned away from their homes by their families, forbidden from having jobs. They were, my siblings and I were among the first children to integrate public schools in Jamaica as Rasta children. So historically, Rastafari have had a lot of trouble in Jamaica, even though Rastafari is the thing that defines Jamaica.
That is surprising in your book, to me.
So to them, this idea of Babylon represents the sort of imperial colonial systems that are coming for them, that they think is coming for them and their families. So that is what Babylon actually means. And then your question about...
I want you to talk more about how your mother helped you escape from your father's very strict...
my mother is a lover of poetry, lover of literature.
Where did she get that?
School. She loved English, she loved reading, she loved poetry. And she just imparted that love to me and my siblings. And, even now she will say to me, like, wow, I just can't believe I have my own personal poet, which is me. She always believed that every child deserved an education. And she thought it was her civic duty to help impart that. So when my siblings and I were younger, she created like an after-school curriculum specifically for us to learn. And then when people at schools started to ask her, like, how come you children so bright? Then she started to teach the children of Montego Bay through her curriculum. Wow. And so I always credit her, which, should I be?
Yes.
I always credit her for, where me and my siblings are and the way that we love literature and the way that even though the world my father gave us seemed constrictive and even more so the older we got, my mother always made sure through our imaginations, through literature, through books, that our world was always expansive. And it felt that way, with once I could write a poem or I could read a book.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Elinor, your book ends on a delightfully warm note, despite all the dysfunction we go through to get there. Do you see comedy itself as a kind of liberation from family pressures?
I do. I mean, I felt that the book, I don't outline, so the book just sort of...
You were surprised by the end?
A little bit. I was more surprised about the brothel because it was just, she calls what could be this homeowner, house for sale, just tried to talk her way into doing the estate sale. And there was something about the woman's attitude and just her lack of manners and her like being in bed with the guy that she just met on a cruise a few days ago. So that I thought, I know that bed and breakfast will have been a brothel. So that's not answering your question. So remind me again what it was.
The way comedy can liberate us from sort of family anxieties and pressures. I mean, your own family too, maybe.
Well, don't forget, I'm not aiming for comedy.
But you attain it.
Well, yes, they tell me I do. But no, I'm just looking to make the story knit together. Of course, I always can't help having happy endings. In this book, I have at least 3 happy endings.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's the trifecta of happy endings.
I do.
Yeah.
I do. Yeah. I don't know.
Susan, did any of the families you studied ever succeed in changing their internal dynamics, like recognizing something about us is not working as a family. We can do something about it, or are they just, trapped?
Oh, well, I don't think anybody in these families felt trapped. I think they generally felt very empowered, or, they went on to be people who had tremendous amounts of agency. I think I wanted to actually, if you don't mind, to address what you were saying, what Sophia was saying about your mom. My book is really about outliers, right? Like on average, parents don't seem to make a really big difference in their kids' lives, but I think we can all agree that, for example, Richard Williams, they could never have achieved what they had their father not devoted himself in this very particular way. One of my favorite lines from the Bronte letters is Patrick Bronte. The biographer of Charlotte Bronte, Elizabeth Gaskell, had written a book that was quite harsh about Patrick Bronte. And he actually responded to the manuscript with his very moderate response. And he basically said, I guess if I'd been, one of the calm, sedate men of the world, then I would not be who I am, and my children should not be who they are either. Yeah. And clearly your mother was extraordinary, and your father was an extremely challenging person, but in his own way, he was extraordinary too. So, a lot of the parents I wrote about of these famous children were not themselves famous, but they were in some way quite unusual and quite determined, and I call a lot of them overcomers. A lot of them would overcome tremendous things.
Toward the end of your book, you acknowledge that luck does play a role in some of these things. How did you, as a journalist, kind of as a social scientist, separate that? Did you make sure that you weren't just reporting on, lightning in a bottle?
Yeah, I really was. I also realized very quickly into the reporting of this book that there's absolutely no way that you can write anything prescriptive, much as you might want to, because so much of what happens to these families is about, luck. There's this amazing story about the Murguia twins, who were both up for being sent to Girls State, which is this wonderful leadership program, and because they were identical twins, the woman in charge of choosing actually decided to flip a coin. So one of the sisters went on to Girls State, and then she did so well there, she went to Girls Nation, and she got a tour of the White House. Right out of college or law school, she moved to DC, she worked in the White House, she became a very close advisor of Bill Clinton's. This is all about the coin toss. And, by the time she was 30, she was flying around on planes and meeting with South American leaders. Her sister was still living at home at age 30. She was forging a brilliant career, and fear not, she ended up the chief judge of the Ninth Circuit eventually, in no small part because of sibling dynamics and the way her insider sister, helped things move. She had all the talent in the world, but connections always do help. Anyway, you couldn't ignore the role of luck when you hear a story like that, and I think most very successful people who are sensitive would acknowledge that there was some luck at play in their own success as well.
Elinor, as a novelist, you're creating plots. You know about coincidence. You probably have. I'm wondering what role coincidence and luck play in your creation of what happens.
Actually, I consider a coincidence like a bad thing. At the convenience of the author, that kind of coincidence. Yes. Not a good thing. I can think of really only in one of my novels where a stepfather who's been estranged from the stepdaughter that he really loved recognizes a picture of her and realizes that it's the young woman who takes his coat at the salon where his haircut. So, it's like, I'm sorry I had to do that. And, but I try to avoid that. And, I spent a lot of time just thinking, what next, what next, what next? And when things seem to be slowing down, or I don't know what to do next, introduce another character.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, that is actually a Faye Weldon tip that I read about, that students were coming to her and saying, a writer's block, and she would say to them, after having read their story or chapter, no, it's not you, it's the material, which is the worst thing that you want to hear. But what she meant was, time to add another character, or maybe cut someone out. So I add another character.
As in life, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious how all of you navigate the tension between honesty and empathy. Susan, did your subjects ever express discomfort about how they were portrayed in your book?
No.
Because they did read it eventually.
Yeah. And before it was published,
Really? Did they sign off?
No. As a New York Times reporter, some authors do absolutely do that, but it's just not my training.
Right.
But I did want them to see it before the public did. I also fact-checked it incredibly carefully with each person in the family who I could reach.
Were they all completely happy in every way?
I don't, there are some questions. I think the Murguias, they're this incredible family. They've achieved so much. They came from such humble backgrounds. As I said, Mary Murguia is the chief judge of the Ninth Circuit. Janet Murguia, her twin sister, runs the single biggest Latino civil rights organization in the country. Her brother, Ramon, is probably one of the most influential Latino philanthropists in the country, is on the board of the Kellogg Foundation. And another brother was a federal judge, so that they were the only two brother-sisters on the federal bench at the same time. And he, over the course of my reporting, resigned from his post because accusations of sexual harassment came out. And the family is so extraordinary that they were extremely honest with me and about how painful that was. And so, although I don't think they felt misrepresented in any way, I do think it's uncomfortable when your entire family brand has been about social justice and about doing the right thing. It's hard to have, and you've given many interviews about the Murguia family and how we got to be who we are. I think it was, in some ways, I don't know this to be true, but I think it was painful to have that part of their family history, which is public. It was covered in the New York Times, among the Washington Post, but it's still painful for that to be part of the public record when they, so much of what they did was to honor their parents, who were incredibly hardworking immigrants, but once again, you can't not tell that story. Right. And I think understanding what happens in these incredibly high-achieving families when failure occurs, which is, as we all know, part of the success cycle, hearing them talk honestly about it and so humbly, I admire them so much. It was very moving.
Well, I'm sure. Sophia, I kept wondering, how's her father going to react to this book?
Yeah.
Because there are some extremely painful chapters. Did he read the book, and how did he respond?
For a long time I would get this question, and I did not have a satisfying answer, because so first of all, when I was writing the book, there were parts of it that I knew I needed to tell through my father's eyes as a young man. I needed to understand how he came to Rastafari and why he chose it, right? And so in many ways, my writing of the book and needing to go deeper brought us closer together, because I had to call him and I had to talk to him about his youth, about his choices. And I began to see him for the first time in a humanized way. He had never really humanized himself to us when we were growing up, because he wanted to be seen as this sort of Godhead figure of the household. And so hearing him talk about his youth and the way that he was spurned by society as a young Rasta man, really gave me insight I never had. Before the book came out, I told him he needed to read it before the world read it. I told him that it would be a hard read for him, but he needed to read it to the end.
Exactly. That's just what I thought, the end.
To read it to the end, and for a long time people would ask me, did he read the book? Did he read the book? And I thought, well, when I gave him the book, I said, don't call me till you've read it to the end. And he never called. And finally, last fall, I asked him, did you read the book? And he said, yes, I read the book. And I said, well, why didn't you say anything? And he said, well, I thought you saw me as so much of a monster that you didn't want to talk to me anymore. Aww. And I thought, no. I said, I don't see you as a monster. You did monstrous things. But did you read to the end? We came to a place, through my poetry and through reading a poem to him, we came to a place of understanding. And a place where I felt that we could actually move forward to a place of healing, and that he began to change. And so, that also led to this difficult but necessary conversation between us that we've never had. And now we have this brand new relationship that I think was the bridge. The book was a bridge to that. And he texts me every day, saying he's proud of me, and go and do. I mean, he says it in his Rasta speak, right? Where he says, "I'm a young queen. Go forward, young queen, and make your way in the world." And so that's where we are now.
That's wonderful to hear. Elinor, do people come to you and say, "This funny thing happened in my family. You should write about it in a book"?
No, not maybe once or twice. Generally, it's not such a great idea, and so I'm polite about it. But I learned my lesson anyway, because one of the first stories I wrote, short story, for a class, never been published, so that was safe. And it was just about this woman I knew, and she was the most obsequious person I'd ever met, and it sort of fascinated me because I'd meet her in the market and ask how she was, and she'd send me a thank you note. So, I found that pretty fascinating. And I wrote a story, and it was safe because I never had a story published. It was just going to be read in class. And then I had a story collection, and I said, I better not put that in. And the lawyers at Viking said, no, that has to go in because that's the most universal character in the book. Everyone knows people who bring unnecessary thank you house gifts. Anyway, she saw the book, she read the book, and she sent me an invoice.
Wait, for how much?
It was something like, this was back, so in $20, $25, but this was, I think it was for $150, and that would have been, the book came out in, I think, 87, so I called my agent, and she said, do nothing, don't answer. But lesson learned, yeah.
That bill is still out there, Elinor.
Yeah. In $20, $25, yeah.
We get to see all your books in their perfected glory, but for years they did not look that way to you. Tell me about the moment when you realized, this is going to work. Because not all your books do work, I'm sure, right? Some books just, they don't finish, or things don't pan out. But tell me about that moment when you thought, yes, this will work.
I sent it to my friend Jen Senior after it was 2 weeks before it was going to press, and she said, "Yeah, this is ready."
That's pretty late.
Yeah, I had a lot of doubts about it.
Really?
I have to say. Yeah.
Why? What caused such anxiety?
Well, I actually am quite proud of the book because it is. Well, thank you. But proud of it because I think it is. I think the narratives are really. I hoped they would be novelistic and they would pull you in, and so I'm proud of the storytelling. But for a while, the failure to come up with answers, felt like I was disappointing my reader. My friend Dave Kirkpatrick, who's a reporter, told me if you ask an honest question and try to answer it, readers will forgive you, even if you don't come up with a clear answer. And that was sort of the thing that got me through, because I'm sorry to say I cannot tell people how to raise high-achieving children. There were some common themes that I found sort of moving about optimism and, a spirit of possibility that I found, personally moving. But
and not too much television. Wasn't that what it? Yeah, right.
Yeah, that's true.
That was true. Yeah, I noticed that. Yes.
Anyway, so that's when. Anyways, I think a lot of authors have a lot of doubts until it goes out into the world.
That late, Elinor. When did you realize this book's going to work?
Well, let's see. I just remember it's such a fond memory about my mother. It was my first novel, which was called Then She Found Me, and I gave it to her to read. And I remember she was visiting me, and she went into, sat on the couch in the TV room, and she started reading it. And she came out and she said, "Ellie, I think you got something here." And so it's a very fond memory. But with every book, send it in. Wait to hear from the editor, and sometimes it takes a long time. And then I start, if a month goes by and I should have heard, I start thinking, she's leaving the job, she's changing publishers, she's been talking to my agent, how they're going to break it to me, like that. So I would say it doesn't get easier. I don't get more confident.
Sophia, when did you realize this memoir will work?
The question that I asked myself before I even could ask, is it working? Will it work? Is, can I write this memoir? I started thinking about writing it more than 10 years ago. When I'd left Jamaica in this very harrowing way, this very, very horrible, violent way between me and my father, and I came to the U.S. to study in Charlottesville, where I got my master's. And that was the first time I started thinking about writing the book. But when I sat down to write it, it felt that everything was so fresh, everything was unprocessed, that I was writing it from a wound, And I didn't want to write this book from a wound. I wanted to write the book, if I could, from a place of hope. And I had a professor at UVA, his name's Gregory Orr, wonderful poet, and he also has a memoir of his own. And he said to me, I think you need to write this book from a place of safety. And this place of safety, I don't think you have that yet.
What do you think he meant?
I think he could see that it was possible I would destroy myself in the writing of the book. And I didn't want that. I also didn't want to write from a place of anger, a place of deep hurt. And so I kind of just put it away. It wasn't until I went back to Jamaica after years away, I was reading my poems at this festival. I invited my father to come and hear me. He'd never heard me read, ever. And I read for him a poem that I'd written for him. And I said, before I read it, I said, I just want you to listen. I just want you to hear me. And when I got off the stage, he embraced me and looked me eye to eye for what felt like the first time. And he said, I'm listening and I hear you. And that was the moment where I felt a lot of that hurt released from me. And I thought, okay, I think I have that place of safety I was looking for, and that I can start to write this book because I know where it ends.
Wonderful. Yeah. Would you all mind taking some questions from the audience?
Yes.
We've got 2 microphones, one on each side. Please just come up and ask whatever you'd like. Yes, sir.
I've very much enjoyed this. There are a couple of things that weren't touched upon. I just go back. I was probably raised more like Sophia than the other 3. And the way my parents were immigrants, had no education whatsoever, and they worked when I was a little kid every day of the year except Christmas. They only took one day off. They had a restaurant. My sister and I lived on top of it. We almost never saw our parents because they were always working. And the way my father treated educating us, he would beat me up if I had a bad mark. That's how it worked. And I ended up doing pretty well. The thing, one of the things I'm wondering is how the environment, we're all parents, and how the environment changes different generations. I was raised in a generation where probably many of the people here, their parents were influenced by Benjamin Spock. Prior to that, there were parents that were influenced by Freud. Now, of course, my parents never read a book. They didn't know. And when I went to college, I found nobody ever talked to me that their parents ever beat them up. But they would talk about some of the neuroses they felt their parents gave them. So I'm just interested to see how you think about this sort of thing.
Thank you.
I wouldn't mind jumping in, actually, just because one of the families I wrote about is the Chen family, and they were an immigrant family from China. 3 of the 4 children were born in China, and they actually fled China because the mom was pregnant with a 3rd child. And it actually is closer to home than you're going to think, but they moved to Appalachia, and they started a restaurant. And they worked 6 or 7 days a week. And it took me a while to hear what the kids were telling me. They're all now very high-achieving people with very glittering lives. but they were telling me that their mother beat them. And whenever they talked about their mother, the oldest sister in particular would get teary because they also worked constantly, the parents. And by the way, this is one of the reasons why the siblings were so close. The parents literally, often in disadvantaged families, the parents are working so hard that the kids are left to their own devices. So these siblings were really important to each other. And, what they came to say was, the sister said to me, she did the best she could about their mother. There's a lot of anger there, and there's a recognition that the relationship is not great, but they also know that they credit her with the fact that they did, their mother didn't have the opportunities they did. She gave them those opportunities. So it's a really complicated feeling, I think, to know you're indebted, but also extremely angry, and maybe you have a right to be, So I think it's, they would never touch their children, the Chen children themselves. So I think that, they're educated. They realize their mother wasn't, that she was under tremendous stress. I mean, this is not to excuse abusing children ever, but they have come to they're both very angry, and they're also trying to make their peace with it. I don't know if that's
Sophia,
helpful.
did you want to say anything?
No, I think that's well said. I think.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I just want to say it's another tribute to my parents, but definitely Dr. Spock. That's the right age. But I once asked, my parents were older when they got married and older when they had us. My mother was 41 when she had me, and my father was 43. And I think that was, contributed to their patience and their kindness. But I once asked my father about, I felt they did a good job. And he said, well, one of the rules we had was to never embarrass the children. And, I just think it's a wonderful thing. And how did he even think about that when they're talking about, new babies? When did they come up with that one?
Right. I'd like to move on to the next person.
I became, later in his life, Dr. Spock's doctor.
Oh, okay, that is worth it.
All I can say is my father learned how to
He became
Thank
Dr. Spock's doctor later in his life.
Yes, ma'am.
It's hard to follow that. But I'm wondering, growing up and throughout college, which writers inspired you? And did you have one particular read where you thought, this is what I want to do for a living? Yeah. Oh, and Elinor, thanks for the idea. I'm sending out the invoices.
We start at the end and go.
A lot of the memoir is really kind of like a Künstlerroman. It's kind of like a journey to my becoming a poet and, becoming a writer. And I talk about along the way the authors that I discovered that led me to being the writer I am today. I began writing at 10, so and the first poem I read at that age that really opened my eyes was a poem by William Blake, The Tiger. And so it began with William Blake, and by the time I was 16, I discovered Sylvia Plath. And I would say at that point, the damage was done. Like, I was like, I'm a poet, There was so much in her voice and what she wrote about that really I related to. And, later I came to Toni Morrison and Lucille Clifton. And these are some of the authors that, really mean a lot to me. Gabriel Garcia Marquez as well. I would say those are some of my like authors on my family tree. Yeah.
I have an easy answer. It was Happy All the Time by Laurie Colwin.
Wow.
And I was about 27 or 28 when I read that. And just didn't even know. I signed up for a course in beginning fiction writing.
Nice.
I was just one of those kids. Books were always, from the time I was so young, books were absolutely my best friend. I just didn't know there were why would anybody ever want to do anything but be a writer? So
Yeah, I'm glad you all
That's how I felt.
became writers. Thank you all so much. I love talking to all three of you. It's very generous of you. Thank you.
Thank you
very
so
much.
much.
So once again, thank you to our panelists and to our moderator. The books will be on sale at the Bunch of Grapes book sale tent over there, and the book signing for the next half hour will be over there. And next up.